Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tracing something honestly pretty mind-blowing. We're going to look at how a hyper-specific, physical, ancient legal code, one you've probably never even heard of, evolved over centuries into a foundational moral standard for protecting the vulnerable. We'll track this whole transformation, starting way back in the ancient Near East and going right through to the New Testament, uncovering a thread of justice that's as profound as it is ancient. Let's get right into it.
So, to really understand this evolution, we have to start with a fundamental question. How exactly did an ancient legal system figure out if an isolated victim of assault was innocent? Think about it. No cameras, no modern forensics, literally nobody around. How on earth did the law protect the helpless in that scenario? Well, the answer lies in a completely groundbreaking legal precedent.
Here's the roadmap for our journey today. First, the field versus the city. 2, the presumption of innocence. 3, King David's capital offense. 4, a shift to the spiritual. 5, defending the vulnerable. And 6, the demand for infinite mercy.
Section 1. The field versus the city.
Okay, so ancient law actually drew a really stark line based entirely on geography. If an assault happened inside a crowded city and no cry for help was heard, the law essentially presumed consent. It's kind of an ancient recognition of the bystander effect, right? The assumption was surely someone would have heard and intervened. But out in the isolated countryside, the field, the legal system automatically gave the isolated victim the benefit of the doubt.
In these ancient legal terms, location was absolutely crucial, specifically because of witnesses. The entire logic of the law hinged on whether people were physically close enough to hear a cry for help. The field represented total isolation, which instantly triggered a completely different, highly protective legal protocol.
Section 2. The presumption of innocence. Now we hit this profoundly protective legal phrase, "no one to save her." And you know, this wasn't just poetic language. It was a rigid, binding, legal definition. By formally recognizing that her isolation literally prevented her from getting help, the law ensured that her lack of rescue could absolutely not be weaponized against her character. It shifted 100% of the culpability directly onto the attacker.
And this is where the protection gets incredibly robust. The ancient text states, as a legal fact, that the young woman cried out. The law did not require the victim to prove she screamed. Think about how stunningly progressive that is for the ancient world. The judges had to automatically assume she resisted but was physically overpowered. It was a built-in safeguard.
Section 3. King David's capital offense.
Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 26 leaves zero room for ambiguity. The text equates this specific type of sexual violence in the field directly to premeditated murder. It treats the assault on a vulnerable, isolated person with the absolute highest severity known to ancient law. No exceptions.
Now, in the ancient Near East, kings were basically untouchable, right? But God's law made no VIP exceptions. When King David abused his immense power to take Bathsheba, he knew he wasn't just making some minor moral slip-up. He had committed a capital offense under this exact, strict code protecting the vulnerable. His guilt was terrifyingly heavy because the law absolutely did not care about his royal status.
And this brilliantly sets up a thematic connection that plays out later in the texts. That legal phrase, "there was no one to save her," perfectly mirrors King David's own desperate cries in the Psalms. When David was hiding out in caves, hunted, completely isolated from human rescue, he became exactly like that vulnerable woman in the field. The key difference here, David writes with the absolute certainty that God is the ultimate savior who hears the cries of the helpless when no one else is around.
Section 4. A shift to the spiritual.
As we move into the New Testament, it takes this foundational principle of protecting the vulnerable and makes a massive shift. It actually moves away from literal geographic boundaries, the physical city versus the physical field, and applies it directly to the spiritual community. Paul uses these exact strict moral standards from the Mosaic Law in 1 Corinthians to remind believers that their physical bodies are now sacred temples. So these ancient physical protection laws incredibly become the bedrock for spiritual boundaries.
Section 5. Defending the vulnerable.
If we look at Matthew chapter 18, it maps out 4 distinct, escalating standards for protecting the vulnerable and extending restorative justice. We start with greatness and protection, move to the parable of the lost sheep, outline strict church discipline, and finally confront the parable of the unforgiving servant. Each step completely builds on the last.
Starting with greatness and protection.
Echoing Deuteronomy's fierce defense of the isolated, Jesus basically steps forward here as the active defender of the weak. He says anyone who humbles themselves like a child is the greatest, and then issues this terrifying warning. He says it is better to have a heavy millstone tied around your neck and be drowned in the sea than to cause a vulnerable little one to stumble. Exploiting or harming the vulnerable carries the absolute highest degree of divine wrath. He doesn't hold back. Next, the narrative shifts to the lost sheep. Jesus describes a shepherd who leaves 99 perfectly safe sheep on the hills to actively search out the one single sheep that went astray. This illustrates so clearly that God does not abandon the broken or the outcast. He answers that exact agony of isolation we saw with David in the caves. God actively pursues the solitary, lost individual to bring them safely back. Then, when outlining a strict legal process for handling sins within the community, church discipline, Jesus builds this directly on the Old Testament law code we started with. He actually quotes the rule from Deuteronomy that every matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And he finishes by saying that where 2 or 3 gather in his name, he is there. When victims step forward to seek justice, God is literally, physically present in the midst of that judicial process. Section 6. The demand for infinite mercy. So when the disciple Peter asks if he should forgive a brother up to 7 times, Jesus replies with an astronomical symbolic number, 70 times 7. He's setting a radical, practically limitless standard for forgiveness within the community. I mean, that number would have sounded utterly impossible to an ancient listener. To explain this, Jesus tells the parable of the unforgiving servant. It's about a man who is forgiven an absolutely astronomical debt by a king, but then turns around and violently chokes a fellow servant over a tiny, insignificant debt. The warning here is stark, guys. Receiving God's staggering mercy strictly obligates us to extend that exact same mercy to others. Accepting absolute protection when we are vulnerable, only to turn around and hold a grudge against a neighbor, is a complete betrayal of the kingdom.
As we wrap up this explainer, we've really seen an incredible journey. We started with literal fields, and a law ensuring a vulnerable woman's lack of rescue wasn't weaponized against her. We watched that concept humble untouchable kings, reshape how spiritual communities view their bodies, and culminate in a radical demand from Jesus to protect the vulnerable at all costs and extend boundless mercy. So we're left to consider a powerful final thought. How can our modern communities take these profound ancient standards, this fierce protection for the isolated, and a demand for infinite mercy, and actually apply them today? What does leaving the 99 to protect the one really look like in our modern world?